I knew the moment he called my permission management system retro artistry that I was in trouble. They fired me over a Zoom call, no warning, no documentation, just a fake smile and a few hollow thank yous. But what they didn't know was this: I still held a forgotten clause in my old contract and that code they were using. It was mine, and they were about to pay for it. My name is Erin Maddox, and I'm 39 years old. For the past 6 years, I'd been the backbone of Voltaren Systems, a mid-tier tech startup that specialized in enterprise security solutions. I wasn't just another developer, I was the architect who built their entire back-end infrastructure from scratch. Every authentication protocol, every data pipeline, every security layer that kept their clients' information safe. That was my handiwork. Then Damien Kessler arrived. The board brought him in as our new CTO with great fanfare. Fresh from a failed startup that had burned through $40 million in venture capital, Damien possessed that particular Silicon Valley combination of supreme confidence and complete technical ignorance. He spoke in buzzwords like disruptive paradigms and velocity-driven innovation while wearing expensive sneakers that cost more than most people's monthly rent. During his first all-hands meeting, Damien stood before our engineering team with a presentation titled Legacy Debt and the Path Forward. Each slide was a masterclass in corporate condescension, filled with charts showing how our outdated systems were supposedly holding back our exponential growth potential. What we have here, he said, clicking to a slide that showed our system architecture, is a classic case of legacy lock-in. Beautiful in its time, I'm sure, but fundamentally incompatible with modern development velocity. I watched from the back of the room as he dismissed 6 years of my work with a casual wave of his hand. Our system wasn't just functional, it was elegant, 0 security breaches, 99.9% uptime, and scalable enough to handle our largest enterprise clients without breaking a sweat. But to Damien, it was simply old. Moving forward, he continued, we'll be implementing a complete architectural overhaul, AI-assisted development, microservices restructuring, and cloud-native everything. We're going to move fast and break things. That phrase made my blood run cold. Move fast and break things was the motto of companies that prioritize growth over stability, flash over substance. It was the philosophy of someone who had never had to explain to a Fortune 500 client why their data had been compromised. After the meeting, I approached Damien with what I thought was diplomatic concern. I'd love to discuss the migration strategy, I said. There are some critical dependencies in the current system that might need special handling during the transition. He looked at me like I'd just suggested we go back to using punch cards. Erin, right, the legacy whisperer. He chuckled at his own joke. Look, I appreciate your institutional knowledge, but we're not migrating anything. We're rebuilding from the ground up. Clean slate, modern stack, 0 technical debt. But the current system handles over 2 million daily transactions across. Which is exactly the problem, he interrupted. You've built a beautiful museum piece, but museums don't scale at startup velocity. What we need is something that can grow with us, not something that requires a PhD in Erinology to understand. That was the first time he used that phrase, Erinology, but it wouldn't be the last. Over the following weeks, it became his favorite way to dismiss any discussion of how our current systems actually worked. Need to understand the authentication flow. That's just Erinology. Wondering about the database sharding strategy. More Erinology. Concerned about maintaining backwards compatibility with existing clients. Pure Erinology. The changes started small. Damien renamed our internal dashboard from Voltaren Control Center to Mission Command, because he thought it sounded more dynamic. He eliminated our peer code review process, claiming it was slowing down development velocity. He brought in an AI pair programming tool that was supposed to accelerate coding, but mostly generated boilerplate that our junior developers didn't fully understand. Then he started targeting me directly. First, I was quietly removed from the weekly strategy meetings. We're streamlining the attendee list to core stakeholders, his assistant explained when I asked about the missing calendar invite. Apparently, The person who built the entire system wasn't considered a core stakeholder in discussions about its future. Next, he began holding separate technical meetings with the younger engineers on my team. I'd walk past conference rooms and see Damien gesticulating enthusiastically while my own team members took notes, discussing architectural decisions that I'd hear about secondhand through office gossip. The most insidious part was how he turned my expertise against me. When junior developers came to me with questions about system behavior, Damien would intercept them. "Don't get lost in the weeds of how things currently work," he'd tell them. "Focus on how things should work in the future. We're not here to maintain the status quo." He had a particular talent for making collaboration feel like insubordination. During one team meeting, I suggested that we needed to audit our new authentication changes because I'd noticed some unusual error patterns in the logs. "Aaron," Damien said with exaggerated patience, "I appreciate your attention to detail, but we can't let perfect be the enemy of good. These are exactly the kinds of legacy concerns that prevent teams from achieving breakthrough velocity." The room fell silent. I could feel my colleagues' discomfort, but none of them spoke up. They were all wondering if they'd be next on Damien's list of legacy concerns. As weeks turned into months, I watched our elegant system become increasingly unstable. The AI-generated code introduced subtle bugs that our shortened review process missed. The new microservices architecture created network latency issues that our monolithic design had elegantly avoided. Error rates crept upward, response times got slower, and our client support tickets tripled. But Damien had an explanation for everything. The bugs were growing pains that would resolve once we achieved full cloud-native integration. The performance issues were temporary artifacts of our hybrid legacy modern architecture. The support tickets were actually positive indicators of increased user engagement. During this chaos, I found myself working later and later, quietly fixing critical issues that Damien's changes had introduced. I couldn't stand the thought of our clients suffering because of his architectural experiments. So I spent my evenings writing patches for problems that shouldn't have existed in the first place. That's when I discovered something that would change everything. I was cleaning out my desk drawer, looking for a USB cable, when I found an old folder containing my original employment contract from 6 years ago. I almost threw it away. Who keeps employment contracts from their current job? But something made me flip through it one more time. Most of it was standard boilerplate salary details, vacation policies, the usual intellectual property assignment clauses. But tucked away on page 7, in a section titled Miscellaneous Provisions, was a paragraph I'd completely forgotten about. It was something my ex-husband Marcus had insisted on when he reviewed my contract before I signed it. Marcus was a corporate attorney who specialized in intellectual property law, and he'd been paranoid about companies taking advantage of talented engineers. The clause read, "In the event that employee's employment is terminated without 90 days prior written notice, any intellectual property developed solely by employee during the course of employment shall revert to employee's ownership, provided that employee can demonstrate sole authorship and original creation of said intellectual property." I stared at that paragraph for a long time. Marcus had called it a nuclear option when he'd negotiated it into my contract, something that would never come up under normal circumstances but might provide protection if things went very wrong. I'd forgotten about it completely because I'd never imagined needing it. Voltaren had always treated me fairly, and the idea of being fired without notice had seemed absurd. But that was before Damien Kessler arrived with his velocity-driven innovation and his disdain for legacy concerns. I spent the next few days quietly documenting everything. Git commit logs showing that I was the sole author of our core authentication system, database schema, API gateway, and permission management infrastructure. Slack messages where I'd explained architectural decisions to colleagues. Email threads where I'd outlined system requirements and design principles. Performance reviews where my manager had explicitly credited me with single-handedly architecting Voltaren's technical foundation. The documentation was overwhelming. Over 6 years, I'd written nearly 200,000 lines of code that formed the backbone of everything Voltaren did. Their entire business depended on software that existed solely because I'd created it. but I kept quiet. I wasn't planning to use this information. I just wanted to understand my options if things continued to deteriorate. Maybe Damien would come to his senses. Maybe the board would recognize that his changes were causing more problems than they solved. Maybe we could find a way to work together. Then came the Zoom call that ended everything. It was a Tuesday morning, and I was reviewing error logs from the previous night when I received a calendar invite for an immediate one-on-one with Damien. No agenda, no context, just quick sync, urgent. I joined the call expecting another lecture about legacy thinking or velocity optimization. Instead, I found Damien sitting in what looked like a coffee shop, wearing a casual shirt I'd never seen before. His usual corporate backdrop had been replaced by exposed brick walls and industrial lighting. "Aaron," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Thanks for jumping on so quickly. I'll keep this brief because I know how busy you are." Something in his tone immediately put me on alert. This wasn't his usual condescending but collegial voice. This was different. Final. "We've been doing a lot of strategic thinking about the team structure going forward," he continued. "And we've made some difficult decisions about organizational efficiency." I felt my stomach drop. I'd heard this language before, in other companies, during other restructurings. These were layoff words. The reality is that we're moving in a direction that requires different skill sets and a different mindset than what we've traditionally emphasized here. We need builders who can work at startup velocity, not maintainers who are focused on preserving existing systems. He was actually doing it. He was firing me via Zoom, without warning, without documentation, using corporate speak that made it sound like a strategic optimization rather than personal retaliation. "Your contributions to Voltaren have been significant," he said, still wearing that artificial smile. "And we're grateful for everything you've built here. But we think this transition is the right move for both you and the company." I sat in stunned silence for a moment, not because I was surprised, I'd seen this coming for weeks, but because of the sheer arrogance of it. He was dismissing the person who'd created the entire foundation his company was built on. And he was doing it with the casual confidence of someone who believed he was untouchable. "When is my last day?" I asked quietly. "Actually, we're making this effective immediately," he replied. "HR will be in touch about final paperwork and transition logistics. Your access will be revoked within the hour to ensure a clean handoff. Effective immediately. No 90 days notice, no 30 days, no warning at all." "I understand," I said. "I'll begin collecting my things." "That won't be necessary," Damien said quickly. "We'll have someone package up your personal items and arrange delivery. For security reasons, we prefer to handle internal transitions internally." Of course they did. They wanted me gone before I could document anything, talk to anyone, or cause any complications for their narrative of organizational optimization. "Is there anything else?" I asked. "Just that we wish you the best in your future endeavors," Damien said. "You're a talented engineer, and I'm sure you'll find something that's a better fit for your particular expertise." The call ended with that backhanded compliment hanging in the digital air. Within 30 minutes, my laptop was remotely wiped, my badge access was revoked, and my company accounts were disabled. It was like I'd never existed, but they'd made a critical error. That evening, I called Max Drexler, the intellectual property attorney that Marcus had recommended during our divorce proceedings. Max specialized in technology disputes and had a reputation for being both brilliant and ruthless when his clients had been wronged. "Aaron," he said when I explained my situation, "this is fascinating and potentially very expensive for them." We spent 2 hours going through my documentation. Max was particularly interested in the Git logs, which provided time-stamped proof of when I'd written each piece of code and whether anyone else had contributed to the work. "Your employment contract is airtight," he said finally. "If they terminated you without 90 days' notice, and you can prove sole authorship of their core systems, then you own the intellectual property. Full stop." What does that mean? Practically speaking, it means they're currently using your software without permission. Every day they operate their business using your code. They're committing copyright infringement. We can demand immediate cessation of use, plus damages for any revenue they've generated using your intellectual property." Max paused, and I could hear him calculating figures in his head. "Based on what you've described about their client base and revenue projections, we're talking about substantial damages, potentially several million dollars." Several million dollars. The number seemed surreal. "What's the process?" I asked. "First, we document everything meticulously. Every line of code, every architectural decision, every commit message. We build an overwhelming case that this intellectual property belongs to you and you alone. Then we send them a cease and desist letter that will ruin someone's entire week." We spent the next week preparing. Max brought in a forensic analyst who specialized in software authentication. And together we built a comprehensive map of Voltaren's technical infrastructure. The results were even more damning than I'd expected. Not only had I authored their core systems, but those systems were so fundamental to their operations that removing them would essentially mean shutting down the company. Their entire client onboarding process, their security protocols, their data processing pipelines, their API interfaces. Everything depended on code that I'd written and that now legally belonged to me. The cease and desist letter was a work of art. 15 pages of legal precision that laid out exactly what Voltaren had done wrong and exactly what they owed me. The key paragraph read, "Our client demands immediate cessation of all use of the aforementioned intellectual property, removal of all instances of said property from your systems, and payment of damages in the amount of $4. 6 million, representing conservative estimates of licensing fees, lost profits, and statutory damages for willful copyright infringement. $4.6 million. Max had calculated this figure based on what they would have paid to license equivalent software from established vendors, plus penalties for unauthorized use, plus compensation for the competitive advantage they'd gained by using my work without permission. "They'll think we're bluffing," Max warned me. "Companies always think independent developers are bluffing when they assert intellectual property rights. They'll probably ignore this completely." He was right. A week passed without any response. Then 2 weeks. Damien and the Voltaren leadership were clearly betting that I didn't have the resources or determination to follow through on legal threats. They were about to learn how wrong they were. But first, I had to watch them dig their hole even deeper. From the outside, I monitored Voltaren's progress through industry publications and social media. Damien was positioning himself as a visionary leader who was modernizing an outdated technology company. He gave interviews about technical debt elimination and velocity-driven transformation. He posted LinkedIn articles about the importance of moving fast and breaking things. 2 months after my termination, Voltaren announced a major product launch. They were rolling out Voltaren 2.0, which Damien described as a complete reimagining of enterprise security built for the modern era. I read the press release with grim fascination. They were essentially rebranding my 6-year-old architecture as revolutionary innovation. The core functionality was identical to what I'd built, but they'd wrapped it in a new user interface and added some AI-powered features that were more marketing gimmick than technical advancement. The launch event was live-streamed, and I watched Damien present my work as his team's breakthrough achievement. He clicked through slides showing system performance metrics that I'd spent years optimizing, security features that I'd designed from scratch, and scalability improvements that represented countless late nights of debugging and refinement. "What you're seeing here," he told the audience of potential clients and investors, "is the result of our commitment to technical excellence and innovative thinking. We've rebuilt our entire platform from the ground up, eliminating decades of accumulated technical debt and implementing cutting-edge solutions that our competitors simply can't match." It was nauseating, but it was also evidence. Every claim he made about building things from the ground up, every assertion of innovative development, every promise of superior technical solutions, it was all based on my work. And he was creating a public record of their dependence on intellectual property that legally belonged to me. The launch initially seemed successful. Voltaren signed several new enterprise clients who were impressed by the system's performance and reliability. Their stock price jumped 20% in the weeks following the announcement. Damien was featured in TechCrunch as one of the industry's rising stars. But I knew something that the market didn't. The system they were celebrating was held together by architectural decisions that none of their current team understood. Damien had fired the person who knew how everything worked, and his AI-assisted developers were essentially maintaining a complex machine without an instruction manual. The cracks started showing about 6 weeks after launch. It began with subtle performance degradation that their monitoring systems weren't sophisticated enough to detect. Response times increased by milliseconds. Error rates crept up by fractions of a percent. Memory usage patterns shifted in ways that suggested optimization algorithms were failing. Then came the cascade failures. I learned about them through my network of former colleagues who'd stayed at Voltaren, the company's Slack workspace, which I could no longer access but which was described to me by friends, had become a panic room of confused engineers trying to understand system behavior that defied their expectations. The authentication service is throwing weird timeouts, one developer reported, but only for users whose session tokens were generated more than 48 hours ago. Database queries are running slower than usual, another noted. The execution plans look normal, but something's causing lock contention in the user permissions table. API gateway is dropping about 2% of requests. A third engineer added, mostly for endpoints that involve complex authorization checks. These weren't random problems. They were the predictable result of modifying a system without understanding its underlying logic. Damien's team had been making improvements to code they didn't fully comprehend, and those changes were creating instabilities that compounded over time. But the real disaster came during their biggest client presentation of the year. Voltaren had spent months courting Pacific Financial, a major investment firm that was considering a complete overhaul of their security infrastructure. The contract was worth $12 million over 3 years, enough to establish Voltaren as a serious player in the enterprise market. The presentation was scheduled for a Thursday morning, with live demonstrations of system capabilities in front of Pacific Financial's technical team. Damien had been preparing for weeks, rehearsing scenarios that would showcase their platform's speed, reliability, and security features. I wasn't there, obviously, but I heard about what happened from 3 different sources who witnessed the meltdown. The presentation started normally. Damien walked through the platform's features, demonstrating user onboarding, permission management, and threat detection capabilities. Everything looked smooth and professional. Then they reached the stress testing portion of the demo. Pacific Financial wanted to see how the system performed under load, so they began simulating thousands of simultaneous user logins. This was supposed to be a strength of our architecture. I designed the authentication system to handle massive concurrent loads by distributing verification tasks across multiple server clusters. Instead, the system collapsed. First, the login response time spiked from milliseconds to seconds. Then the database connection pool maxed out, causing new authentication requests to queue indefinitely. Finally, the API gateway started returning 500 errors for any requests that required database access. Within 10 minutes, the entire demonstration environment was down. Damien tried to recover by switching to a backup environment, but the same problems emerged as soon as they began load testing. He explained that they were experiencing unusual network conditions and offered to reschedule the technical demonstration. Pacific Financial's CTO was not impressed. If your system can't handle a basic load test in a controlled environment, she said, how can we trust it with our production workloads? The contract fell through within a week, but the real damage was just beginning. Word traveled fast in the enterprise security industry. Within days, potential clients were asking pointed questions about system stability. Existing customers reported similar performance issues in their production environments. Industry analysts began downgrading their assessments of Voltaren's technical capabilities. The company's stock price started sliding. Investor confidence wavered. Board members demanded explanations for the sudden deterioration in system performance, and that's when Max sent the follow-up letter. The second letter was shorter than the first but much more pointed. It referenced the public claims Damien had made about rebuilding their systems from the ground up. and it noted that those claims were demonstrably false given their continued dependence on my intellectual property. Your client's public statements constitute willful misrepresentation of intellectual property ownership, Max wrote. This willful infringement increases statutory damages and strengthens our client's position in any future litigation. More importantly, the letter included a detailed technical analysis showing exactly which parts of Voltaire's current system infringed on my intellectual property rights. It wasn't just the core authentication logic, it was the database schema, the API architecture, the security protocols, the performance optimization algorithms, and the monitoring infrastructure. Cessation of use of the infringing intellectual property would require a complete shutdown of client operations. The letter concluded. However, our client remains open to licensing negotiations that would allow continued operation under appropriate terms. This time, they responded. I was having coffee with a former colleague when my phone rang. Max's name appeared on the screen, and his voice was barely containing excitement when I answered. They want to meet, he said, tomorrow afternoon. Their general counsel, their CTO, and 2 outside attorneys they've brought in from Morrison & Associates. What's their position? Officially, they're claiming that your work was done as an employee, so it belongs to the company, regardless of the contract language. And unofficially, they're terrified. Morrison & Associates specializes in intellectual property crisis management. You don't bring in crisis management attorneys unless you think you're about to lose a very expensive lawsuit. The meeting took place in Morrison & Associates' downtown conference room. I sat next to Max while 5 attorneys representing Voltaren arranged themselves across a polished mahogany table that probably cost more than most people's cars. Damien wasn't there. According to their general counsel, he was focused on technical remediation efforts and couldn't attend. I suspected he was being kept away from legal discussions because his public statements had made their position harder to defend. The opposing attorneys opened with a predictable strategy: intimidation through legal complexity. They questioned the validity of my contract clause, challenged my documentation of sole authorship, and suggested that any code I'd written was inherently derivative of the company's existing systems. Max dismantled their arguments methodically. He walked through Git commit logs, showing that I'd created the initial repository structure from scratch. He presented email threads where I'd explained my architectural decisions to colleagues who clearly didn't understand the technical details. He showed performance reviews where my managers had explicitly credited me with developing systems that didn't exist before I joined the company. Your client isn't just using Ms. Maddox's intellectual property, Max said calmly. Their entire business model depends on it. Every client contract, every revenue stream, every competitive advantage they claim, it all traces back to software that legally belongs to my client. The room fell silent as the implications settled in. Voltaren couldn't simply stop using my code and replace it with something else. The replacement process would take months or years, during which they'd have no product to offer and no revenue to sustain operations. Their lead attorney tried a different approach. What would your client consider reasonable licensing terms? Max and I had anticipated this question. We'd spent considerable time researching industry standards for intellectual property licensing, and we'd developed a proposal that was aggressive but defensible. My client is willing to grant a limited license for continued use of her intellectual property, Max replied. The terms would include immediate payment of $4.6 million in back damages, plus ongoing licensing fees of $200,000 per month. $200,000 per month. It was an enormous figure, but it was calculated based on what they would pay for equivalent commercial software licenses. More importantly, it was structured to ensure that I maintained control over my intellectual property while allowing them to continue operating. Additionally, Max continued, the license will be contingent on certain technical and organizational conditions. Ms. Maddox would have consultation rights on any modifications to the license systems, and she would retain the right to revoke the license if the company misrepresents the origin or ownership of the intellectual property. Consultation rights meant that they couldn't make changes to my code without my approval. Revocation rights meant that I could shut them down if they continued claiming credit for my work. The Voltaren attorneys requested a recess to discuss the proposal. For 30 minutes, I could hear muffled arguing through the conference room walls. When they returned, their lead attorney looked like he'd aged 5 years. "Our client needs time to evaluate this proposal with their board and investors," he said. "Can we have 72 hours to respond?" "Of course," Max replied. "But I should mention that we'll be filing a preliminary injunction request on Friday if we don't reach an agreement by then." A preliminary injunction would immediately prohibit Voltaren from using my intellectual property while the legal case proceeded. Given their complete dependence on my code, an injunction would effectively shut down their business overnight. We left them to contemplate that possibility. While Voltaren's attorneys were scrambling to find a solution that didn't involve paying me millions of dollars, the company's technical problems were getting worse. The performance issues that had started during the Pacific financial demonstration were spreading throughout their system. Customer support tickets were increasing exponentially as clients experienced slowdowns, timeouts, and intermittent failures. Their monitoring dashboards showed error rates climbing toward unacceptable levels. Damien's team was working around the clock to identify and fix the problems, but they were fighting a losing battle. Every patch they implemented seemed to create new issues elsewhere in the system. They were like mechanics trying to repair a complex engine without access to the blueprints. They could replace individual components, but they couldn't understand how those components interacted with the larger whole. The situation reached a breaking point when one of their largest clients, a multinational corporation whose name I recognized from industry publications, experienced a complete authentication system failure during peak business hours. For 6 hours, none of their employees could access critical business applications. The client's IT director described it as the worst security infrastructure failure in company history. Within 24 hours, that client terminated their contract and demanded a full refund of their annual licensing fees. 2 other major clients followed within the week. Voltaren's stock price, which had already been declining, went into freefall. Industry analysts published scathing reports about the company's technical capabilities. Technology blogs began speculating about potential acquisition targets or bankruptcy scenarios. And that's when I received an unexpected phone call. "Ms. Maddox, this is Rebecca Ward from Morrison & Associates. I represent Voltaren Systems, and I have an unusual request." Rebecca explained that she was calling on behalf of Voltaren's board of directors, not their management team. The board had become aware of the intellectual property dispute and wanted to explore resolution options that didn't involve destroying the company. "To be frank," she said, "the board is questioning whether current management has handled this situation appropriately. They're interested in discussing alternative arrangements that might be more collaborative." Alternative arrangements, it was corporate speak for, "We're thinking about firing everyone and starting over." I agreed to meet with Rebecca, but only with Max present and only under strict confidentiality terms. The meeting took place the following morning in a neutral location, a private dining room at an upscale hotel downtown. Rebecca was different from the attorneys I'd dealt with previously. She was direct, pragmatic, and clearly focused on finding solutions rather than winning arguments. More importantly, she seemed to understand the technical realities of Voltaren's situation. "The board recognizes that your intellectual property is fundamental to the company's operations," she said without preamble. "They also recognize that the current management team has created an untenable situation through poor decision-making and inadequate technical leadership." She paused, studying my reaction before continuing. "What I'm about to suggest is unconventional, but the board believes it might serve everyone's interests. They'd like to offer you a position as Chief Product Strategist, with full authority over technical architecture and intellectual property strategy." Chief Product Strategist. It wasn't just a job offer. It was an invitation to take control of the technical direction of a company that depended entirely on my work. "What happened to the current CTO?" I asked. "Mr. Kessler's employment was terminated yesterday evening," Rebecca replied matter-of-factly. "The board concluded that his leadership approach was incompatible with the company's long-term success." Damien was gone. The man who'd called my work legacy artistry, who'd dismissed my expertise as errantology, who'd fired me via Zoom without warning, He'd been ejected from the company he'd tried to remake in his image. The position would come with significant autonomy, Rebecca continued. You'd report directly to the board, not to the CEO. You'd have full authority over technical hiring, architecture decisions, and intellectual property strategy. And of course, you'd retain ownership of your existing intellectual property while licensing it back to the company under terms we'd negotiate separately. It was an extraordinary offer. Not only would I regain control over my technical creations, but I'd have the power to prevent future leaders from making the kinds of destructive decisions that had nearly destroyed the company. But there was something else I wanted, something that would ensure this situation never happened again. I appreciate the offer, I said carefully. But I'm not interested in returning as a traditional employee. If I'm going to work with Voltaren again, it needs to be as an independent contractor with very specific terms. Max leaned forward. We'd discussed this possibility during our preparation for the meeting. My client would consider a consulting arrangement, he said, but it would need to include several non-negotiable elements. First, she retains full ownership of all intellectual property she's created or will create. Second, she has absolute authority over any technical decisions involving her intellectual property. Third, the company pays licensing fees on a monthly basis, which can be revoked if the terms are violated. Rebecca took notes as Max outlined our requirements. The arrangement we were proposing was unusual. Essentially, I would become a critical vendor rather than an employee, with the power to shut down the company if they violated our agreement. Additionally, I added, I want the right to approve any public statements about the technology platform. No more claims about building things from the ground up. No more misrepresentation of intellectual property ownership. This was about more than money or control. It was about ensuring that my work would be accurately represented and properly credited going forward. Rebecca promised to present our proposal to the board within 24 hours. Given Voltaren's deteriorating situation, I expected them to move quickly. They did. By the following afternoon, I had a formal offer that met most of our requirements. The financial terms were substantial $4 million in immediate payment for past damages, plus monthly licensing fees of $150,000. The consulting arrangement would pay me an additional $50,000 per month for ongoing technical guidance and architecture oversight. More importantly, the contract gave me unprecedented control over the technical aspects of the business. I would have final approval over all architectural decisions, hiring of senior technical staff, and public representations of the technology platform. It was everything I'd asked for and more. But I found myself hesitating. Part of me wanted to simply walk away. Take the settlement money, retain ownership of my intellectual property, and let Voltaren figure out their own path forward. I could license my technology to other companies or start my own consulting practice. I didn't need to go back to a place where I'd been treated so poorly. But another part of me was drawn to the idea of fixing what Damien had broken. The system that was failing wasn't some abstract piece of software. It was my creation, my digital offspring, and watching it deteriorate under incompetent management felt like watching someone mistreat a child. I decided to accept the offer, but with one modification. I'll do it, I told Rebecca during our final negotiation call. But I want it understood that this is temporary. I'm coming back to stabilize the situation and establish proper technical governance. Once the systems are healthy and the team is properly trained, I reserve the right to step back to a purely oversight role. The message was clear. I wasn't returning to save their company out of loyalty or nostalgia. I was returning as a professional who took pride in her work and wanted to ensure it was properly maintained. My first day back at Voltaren was surreal. The office felt different, smaller somehow, and much quieter than I remembered. The energetic buzz of a growing startup had been replaced by the nervous tension of a company in crisis mode. Developers hunched over their computers with the focused intensity of people trying to solve problems they didn't fully understand. I'd been given a corner office with windows overlooking the city, a significant upgrade from my previous cubicle. The title on my door read Chief Product Strategist, and beneath it, in smaller text, Technical Architecture Oversight. My first meeting was with the interim CTO, a veteran engineer named Sarah Kim, who'd been promoted from senior developer when Damien was fired. Sarah was technically competent, but clearly overwhelmed by the scope of problems she'd inherited. "I'm so glad you're back," she said with obvious relief. "We've been trying to understand why the system performance has degraded so badly. But honestly, some of the architectural decisions are beyond our current expertise." I spent the morning reviewing the changes that had been made to my code over the past 6 months. It was like examining a masterpiece that had been improved by someone who'd never learned proper painting techniques. The core structure was still sound, but layers of well-intentioned modifications had created instabilities that cascaded through the entire system. "Here's what happened," I explained to Sarah and her team during an afternoon technical review. The authentication caching system was designed to balance performance with security by maintaining user session data across multiple server clusters. But these modifications to the cache invalidation logic have created race conditions that cause session tokens to expire unpredictably. I clicked through code samples on the conference room screen, highlighting the specific lines that were causing problems. And this change to the database connection pooling was intended to improve performance under high load, but it actually creates lock contention that slows down the exact operations it was supposed to accelerate. The fixes weren't complicated, but they required understanding the underlying design philosophy that had guided my original architectural decisions. Within a week, we'd restored system stability to pre-Damien levels. Within a month, performance metrics were better than they'd ever been. But the real work wasn't technical, it was cultural. Damien's brief tenure had damaged more than just the codebase. His dismissive attitude toward existing knowledge and his emphasis on speed over understanding had created a team culture that undervalued expertise and experience. Junior developers had been encouraged to make changes without fully comprehending the consequences, while senior engineers had been marginalized for raising concerns about system stability. I spent considerable time rebuilding trust and establishing new development practices. We implemented comprehensive code review processes, created detailed documentation for all critical systems, and established mentorship programs that paired junior developers with senior engineers. Most importantly, I made it clear that technical decisions would be based on evidence and expertise, not charisma and buzzwords. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but within 6 months, Voltaren was functioning better than it had in years. System performance was rock solid, customer satisfaction scores were at all-time highs, and we'd successfully onboarded several major new clients who'd been impressed by our technical capabilities. The financial recovery was equally dramatic. The company's stock price stabilized and then began climbing as quarterly results demonstrated consistent growth and profitability. Industry analysts upgraded their ratings, noting Voltaren's renewed focus on technical excellence and sustainable growth. But the most satisfying moment came when I received a LinkedIn message from someone I'd never met. "Hi, Aaron," the message read. "I'm a software engineer at Pacific Financial. I know you probably don't remember, but your team at Voltaren gave us a product demonstration about a year ago that didn't go very well. I just wanted to let you know that we've been evaluating your updated platform, and it's genuinely impressive. We're planning to move forward with a pilot implementation next quarter." Pacific Financial, the client that Damien had lost during his disastrous live demonstration. They were coming back because the system was finally working the way it was supposed to. After 2 years in my chief product strategist role, I made the decision to step back to a pure oversight position. The crisis had passed, the team was functioning well, and the technology platform was healthy and growing. I transitioned to a consulting arrangement that required only a few days per month of my time, mostly focused on reviewing major architectural changes and providing guidance on strategic technical decisions. It gave me the flexibility to pursue other interests while ensuring that my intellectual property remained properly managed. Damien Kessler, meanwhile, had struggled to find another CTO position. Word had spread through Silicon Valley's tight-knit technology community about his role in Voltaren's near collapse, and companies were reluctant to hire someone who'd nearly destroyed a business through poor technical leadership. The last I heard, he was working as a strategic consultant for early-stage startups, essentially helping companies that were too small to hire a full-time CTO. It was a significant step down from running technical operations at an established company, but it was probably appropriate for someone whose expertise was more theoretical than practical. I never spoke to him directly after my return to Voltaren. We passed each other once in an airport terminal about 6 months after his termination, and I could see him recognize me from across the concourse. He looked like he wanted to approach and say something, perhaps apologize, or explain his perspective, or offer some kind of justification for his actions. But then he seemed to think better of it and walked in the opposite direction. I understood his hesitation. What do you say to someone whose work you dismissed as obsolete, whose expertise you mocked as irrelevant, whose career you tried to end, and who then saved the company you'd nearly destroyed? There really wasn't a conversation that could bridge that gap. Looking back on the entire experience, I'm struck by how easily it all could have been avoided. If Damien had approached our technology platform with curiosity rather than dismissal, if he'd tried to understand the existing systems before proposing to replace them, if he'd treated the people who built those systems as collaborators rather than obstacles, none of the subsequent drama would have been necessary. But ego and ignorance are a dangerous combination, especially in leadership positions. When you're convinced that everything built before your arrival is inherently inferior, you miss opportunities to learn from the expertise of others. When you believe that moving fast is more important than understanding complexity, you create problems that moving even faster can't solve. The technology industry has a particular weakness for leaders who promise to transform everything through sheer force of vision and velocity. These leaders often achieve short-term success by discarding existing constraints and processes, but they frequently create long-term instabilities that emerge only after they've moved on to their next transformation project. Damien was a perfect example of this phenomenon. He arrived at Voltaren with impressive credentials and compelling rhetoric about innovation and growth. He identified real problems with our development velocity and proposed solutions that sounded modern and sophisticated. He attracted talented engineers who were excited about working on cutting-edge technology. But underneath the compelling presentation was a fundamental lack of understanding about how complex systems actually work. He saw our stable, proven architecture as an obstacle to innovation rather than a foundation for sustainable growth. He treated institutional knowledge as organizational baggage rather than competitive advantage. The irony is that many of his goals were actually achievable within the constraints of our existing architecture. We could have improved development velocity without discarding functional systems. We could have modernized our technology stack without rebuilding everything from scratch. We could have attracted new talent without dismissing existing expertise. But that approach would have required collaboration, patience, and humility, qualities that don't always align with the Silicon Valley mythology of visionary leadership. In the end, the market corrected his mistakes in the most direct way possible by making them too expensive to ignore. When client contracts were lost, when system failures became public, when stock prices fell and investors demanded explanations, the rhetoric of transformation had to give way to the reality of basic operational competence. My intellectual property clause was the mechanism that forced this correction. But it wasn't the underlying cause. The real problem was a leadership philosophy that prioritized disruption over understanding, speed over stability, and vision over execution. The clause simply ensured that the people who'd created value couldn't be discarded by someone who didn't understand that value. Which brings me to the broader lesson of this experience: when you're building something important, make sure you understand who actually built it and how they built it. When you're changing something complex, make sure you understand why it works before you decide how to make it better. And when you're managing people who have created the foundation of your success, remember that dismissing their expertise might feel like visionary leadership, but it's usually just expensive ignorance. 6 months ago, I received an email that made me smile. It was from a young software engineer at a different company who'd heard about my experience at Voltaren through industry networking events. She was facing a situation where new management was questioning the architecture she'd built and proposing to replace it with something more modern. "I've been reading about intellectual property protection for software developers," she wrote. and I was wondering if you could recommend a good attorney who specializes in technology contracts. I forwarded her Max Drexler's contact information along with a note. Make sure your next contract includes proper IP protection clauses. You never know when you might need them. Because the most important lesson isn't about revenge or legal strategies or even standing up to bad management. The most important lesson is this: when you build something valuable, make sure you retain the power to protect it. When you fire the woman who wrote the rules of the game, make sure she doesn't remember where she keeps the original playbook.